Now, North Korea vowed to never give up its nuclear arsenal at a rare address to the United Nations General Assembly on Monday. The announcement comes at a politically unstable time with growing international concerns around nuclear proliferation. Amid these threats, a bipartisan task force has urged the United States to reconsider how it intercepts the expansion of this destructive industry. Ernest Moniz and Megan O'Sullivan, co-chairs of this task force, joined Walter Isaacson with their recommendations.
Thank you, Christian and Megan O'Sullivan and Ernie Muniz. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Nice to be here.
Megan, you and Ernie were among the co-chairs of a report that just came out, and I think it's published recently, on the Task Force on Nuclear Proliferation and U.S. National Security. What was the point of that, Megan?
The origins of the task force, I'd say, go back even just as far as 1964. And we think about, at that time, China detonated a nuclear weapon, and President Lyndon Johnson brought together a group of foreign policy experts to say, what does the next phase of potential nuclear proliferation look like? It was called the Gilpatrick Commission, and they came out with a number of recommendations and considerations that were then implemented and led to 60 years of essentially a period of minimal proliferation of nuclear weapons. We're now at a period where Ernie and our other co-chair, Tino Cuellar from the Carnegie Endowment, we assess that we're at a moment where the potential for greater nuclear proliferation has not been greater in decades. And so, again, we are faced with a very rapidly changing geopolitical environment, one that we think lends itself to much greater proliferation of nuclear weapons. So we convene this bipartisan task force in an effort to, again, look at the question, is this a national security priority of the United States to advance non-proliferation? And if so, are the tools and the architecture that have withstood the test of time for 60 years, are they still well suited to today? And that was the reason that we convened that task force, and the results, as you said, were published just last week.
Ernie, as Megan said, it was chaired 60 years or so ago by Roz Gilpatrick, who was Deputy Secretary of State. But it was a Lyndon Johnson Presidential Commission. Y'all were self-organized. Is there a problem that we don't have, the government, the president, trying to figure this out?
Well, Walter, I think clearly, first of all, let me just say that this task force today came to the same high-level conclusion of the Gilpatrick Commission, namely that nuclear nonproliferation is indeed central to our security and should remain a priority. But this commission was a non-governmental commission, and one of our recommendations and I'll come back to your question, for example, was about the need to really rethink extended deterrence, how our allies consider U.S. security guarantees. There have always been uncertainties, but I would say now, going back to your question, today, some of the directions being taken in the United States by the administration, for example, they do elevate some of those concerns about reliability of U.S. commitments. So I would say that distinction really did come into play in our considerations.
So, Megan, Ernie just talked about extended deterrence, which those of you in the foreign policy business know what it means. But basically, it means don't get nuclear weapons of your own. Don't worry. We, the U.S., will use our deterrent capability so that you don't particularly need them. Do you think that's believable these days, Megan? Is that still a good policy? Why are you all supporting extended deterrence?
Well, there's two important points here, Walter. The first is, yes, the task force was unequivocal in saying that developing, maintaining a robust extended deterrence is absolutely essential to a successful continuation of non-proliferation objectives. Now, we recognize that it is harder today to make that a credible argument to many of our allies. And it's not just at this moment in time, it's really over the span of, multiple administrations that I think many of our allies are questioning America's commitment and reliability. Some of this just has to do with, it goes back to, is America overextended? And I would say, particularly now, there are many allies who are questioning whether or not the United States will be willing to use the extended deterrent or to provide the extended deterrent. I think that was one of the reasons why we created the task force, is to say it's a changed geopolitical environment. You have China becoming, a country that has a very large nuclear arsenal. You have Russia now threatening the use of nuclear weapons. You have Iran, a proliferation threat like we haven't seen from Iran before, the current military force notwithstanding, and the questions over extended deterrence.
Arnie, we just heard Megan say that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has been throwing around the implication that he could use nuclear weapons. In a speech that President Trump gave to the military this week, he kind of addressed that. And he was talking about Putin saying, President Trump said he had moved to submarines because of it. And he says, we cannot let people throw around that word, the N word. And by N word, he meant nuclear. Do you think that President Trump is on this page, that we really have to keep a deterrence and also keep a non-proliferation policy?
Yes, I do, actually. And in fact, just to elaborate slightly on what Megan said in this context, part of the extended deterrence is, in fact, the idea that our allies need to, frankly, strengthen their military postures, and then have those postures integrated with our nuclear deterrent. Strengthening their conventional postures is, of course, very consistent with what the president has been advocating. I would also say that with regard to Russia specifically, but also I would say China, clearly a lot of the success in nonproliferation during the Cold War and beyond the Cold War came from great power relationships, the U.S. and the USSR, and then Russia, working together despite disagreements on a shared interest in nonproliferation. That continues today. It's a little bit creaky, shall we say, the great power coordination, but is something where we again recommend re-engaging in that despite the differences with both Russia and China. Now, President Trump, one other thing, Walter, I'll just add is that President Trump, long before he was president, going back to the 1980s, in fact, was speaking out against nuclear weapons. He has spoken many times about trying to decrease their role in our security posture. And in fact, it was just earlier this year in May where Vice President Vance explicitly said that the president, I think to use his words, hates proliferation, and I hate proliferation. So I think there are elements there to build on, and that's exactly what our report tries to address and to make suggestions. For example, I'll end by just saying that one of the recommendations is that the three countries, perhaps even expanded to other nuclear weapon states, at least the 5 original weapon states, if not more, could, for example, collectively commit to not threaten or use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. Well, that would be an incentive for them, in fact, to stay.
Well, Putin just did the opposite.
I'm sorry?
Well, President Putin just did the opposite.
No,
nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state. Ukraine.
Exactly, and that's one reason why I have said for sure that President Putin really crossed a line there and did something unprecedented. The idea here is it would be great to put that genie back in the bottle. It's not easy, but that kind of negative security assurance would be, we think, quite effective if we can get there. And I think the president would be interested in going in that direction.
Megan, talking about Ukraine, Ukraine had nuclear weapons when it ended up not being part of the Soviet Union anymore. And we convinced them to give up the nuclear weapons by saying, don't worry, you don't need them, we'll defend you. Boy, that doesn't make me feel very confident that we can talk other countries into doing that.
Well, I think there's, as you know, Walter, a very long history there and contested in some ways. But I think the big point that you're making is a very valid point, that many countries around the world not only look at Ukraine and giving up nuclear weapons that were on their soil when the Soviet Union dissolved, but they also look at the Libyan example or the Iraq example, and they think, countries that give up nuclear weapons or don't have nuclear weapons are ones that are subject to aggression. And they look at other countries, the most obvious one being North Korea, which is the only country in this century to have acquired nuclear weapons. Actually, against perhaps all odds, you see, the leader of North Korea comfortably in place. And so I think the lesson that many countries have is that pursuing a nuclear weapon could be in their national security interest. And again, the purpose of the task force is to ask how we can recalibrate our policy and upgrade our tools and the architecture that the international community has to kind of make sure that countries aren't making those kinds of calculations, so that they have, new or more credible incentives to stay non-nuclear. So one of the findings of the task force, which I think is very significant, particularly in this political moment, is that, again, a bipartisan group of foreign policy national security experts all agreed that even the U.S. allies should not be in a position to gain a nuclear weapon, that's not in the U.S. interest, that it is in the U.S. interest to convince them not to pursue one. And the reason why this is so significant is some of your viewers may know that, there's an active conversation in Washington about, well, maybe it would be cheaper and more efficient and easier for the United States if some of our allies had their own nuclear weapon. We wouldn't have to provide that extended deterrent in the same way. And this group really concluded that's a very risky approach to take. And we need to invest again in finding a way to ensure that our allies, that they do not need to go down this road in order to guarantee their own security.
Ernie, how could you say with a straight face to the people of South Korea that now that we've allowed North Korea to get a nuclear weapon, they aren't safer and better off with one?
We think that we need to maintain our alliance, if you like, with South Korea. We continue to provide a nuclear deterrent, but what's really important is in an integrated way, improving our conventional capabilities. As a reminder, and you know this quite well, Walter, that the threats to South Korea are not simply from North Korea's nuclear capabilities. They have artillery lined up essentially along the border with South Korea that could pretty much annihilate Seoul. So it really comes down to an integrated regional strategy for security, and that's what we would advocate.
Megan, you're not just a defense expert, you're a whole foreign policy expert. And when we're talking about this, we talk about the need for Russia and China to work together with us to do it. That seems to me that we're in the least capable position we've been in for 20, 30 years to get both those countries to work with us. In fact, somehow we've driven Russia and China into a closer partnership, at least. There's so much we would need to do with both countries, from AI to climate to nuclear proliferation to bio to gene editing. Is there a way we can get back to having more pragmatic relationships, especially with China?
The answer to your question is sort of twofold. One, in the report, we talk about how having a successfully rejuvenated global non-proliferation regime cannot be done by the United States alone. It has to be done with some kind of cooperation with Russia and China. We're not advocating an immediate resuscitation of talks. We're saying that we're hopeful and we would recommend that those talks happen as soon as is possible. But most important, I think we acknowledge and make the case very credibly that we still have common interest with both Moscow and Beijing. in preventing more states from becoming nuclear weapons states. And so, you suggest, could we imagine a world in which we're having productive conversations with them across a very wide range of things? We're saying we should not wait until the relationship is that thawed to pursue these talks, that there are common interest among these three powers in having a world with less proliferation. And therefore, we should try to find ways to pursue this. It's actually interesting, on the day we released the report, it was the same day that Vladimir Putin said that he would be willing to adhere to the limits on the development of nuclear arsenals a year beyond the expiration of the New START treaty, which will happen in February. So in the absence of some kind of, temporary understanding, as of February 2026, the world will be without any limitations on the development of nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia for the first time in decades.
Well, let me follow up on that. Do you think the Trump administration will want to extend this, what's called the START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Talk Treaty?
Yeah, I can't speak for the Trump administration, but it would make to me, and I think, I'll speak for myself at this moment, it would make to me a lot of sense to take Vladimir Putin up on that. I think there might be other motivations that Vladimir Putin has in extending that offer. Perhaps he's looking to, try to muddy the water between, be tough on Ukraine and nice on nuclear matters, or perhaps he's looking for limitations on the Golden Dome project that the Trump administration is committed to. But, without commenting on what other elements might come into that conversation, I would imagine the Trump administration would find it very much in its interest to have more time to be able to develop a follow-on to the New START. And this goes back to Ernie's point about how President Trump has been clear that he is not interested in seeing any more nuclear proliferation around the world. And so this is, this would be something that we should recognize as a positive step, although not mistake it for any kind of, warming of a relationship with Moscow.
Walter, can I just add that I think it's easy to be somewhat cynical about the offer. For one thing, the Russian economy is in no position to greatly expand its nuclear arsenal. Frankly, neither are we in a position to expand our nuclear arsenal right now, given some of the challenges in terms of so-called modernizing the arsenal. Nevertheless, completely agree with Megan that having those guardrails at least extended is a very, very good signal, and one that has to be capitalized on by having other discussions start. Despite the Ukraine situation, we can have other discussions. And by the way, New START, of course, it puts these quantitative limits on, which is what Putin offered to extend. But there are other elements as well in terms of inspections, very, very tricky in this current environment, in terms of data exchange, which could be still possible, certainly alerts in terms of missile tests. So I think the issue is, I very much hope the president will accept the offer, but accept it with the statement, and let's keep talking and get some other things in place.
Megan O'Sullivan, Arnie Muniz, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.
Thank you, Walter.
He sought to cover researchers who are hunting for invisible creatures, eating invisible food on the ocean floor, and realized that in order to do the story justice, he had to learn how to scuba dive. To explain what he found and what it's like to report underwater, Raymond joins me now from London. Raymond, it's good to see you on solid ground. First of all, you've been covering climate from the surface for many, many years as a climate reporter. What finally led you and inspired you to not only study it beneath the ocean, but also to scuba dive to do some of your own research and reporting?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. So many of us live near the ocean. So many of us live near coasts, lots of cities on coasts, and yet it's a really easy thing to never think about. Despite being so huge, it's almost huge beyond human comprehension. And so we can sort of look out on it and think it's just sort of there eternally, unending. And of course, that's not true. If we talk about what humans are doing to the planet, the oceans cover so much of the surface that it's a huge part of it's feeling the effects. 90% of the extra heat that humans are trapping near Earth's surface ends up in the ocean. The ocean is storing up so much of the heat that we're keeping near the planet. And that's obviously having huge changes down below that we just don't see. And I think part of what I felt like I just have to do in this job is to make people see the natural world, see what's under their nose, see what's all around them. And I think I'd had a couple of opportunities to write about scientists working underwater, scientists who can dive, and I kept thinking, wow, that'd be really cool to go with them. And I think it finally just came to a head with this story, and I said I should do it. And I went and got certified.
And you say you're not a thrill seeker, so was it hard to learn how to scuba dive? What were some of the most challenging aspects of it?
I'd gone snorkeling. I think I'm a pretty good swimmer, and I sort of walked in on my first day of lessons feeling full of confidence. And basically, at 1 inch below the surface, when you sort of are in a pool learning to breathe, I had a little freak out. I think there's a psychological barrier that you have to overcome if you're a human being used to breathing air. To suddenly have to do it into a machine that's sort of it's a well-designed machine. The technology is great, but you really have to face a sort of a little voice in your brain telling you this is not normal, this is not natural. And I think that's a big part of what scuba teaches you. We are land creatures, and we are not meant to live in the ocean, so you have to have a certain humility toward the power of the water.
And you have to allow the machines ultimately to do what they're designed to do. What surprised you the most when you dropped 40 to 50 feet about the ocean, or about how you viewed the ocean in your reporting?
I think it's just really, it's a different planet almost. You just come to appreciate, you think you understand what it means for creatures to live on the ocean floor. But until you're there, until you're seeing it up close, I think even frankly pictures don't do it justice. It's just its own world down there. And it really feels like if more people could see it up close, if more people could sort of appreciate, and it's not even just things you can see, it's ocean currents, which we can't see. It's the sort of changes in temperature that are happening invisibly, even when you're down there. You just sort of do appreciate the scale and the immensity of the activity that's happening there.
Yeah, and off the coast of Tuscany, you followed scientists who are hunting microbes that eat methane at mud volcanoes. What did you see down there, and what does that tell you about the health of our planet and specifically our oceans?
Well, I came to this story thinking, well, how do you even collect a microbe underwater? And I think part of it was just to understand what science under the ocean, how it works. The answer to that question is you have a plastic bag that you sort of twirl around in the water, and you imagine that's where microbes are, and then you have to go back in the lab, but you have this plastic bag full of water, you have tubes full of water. To a large degree, I see my job as just helping people understand how we know anything about the ocean. It is so vast. It is sort of, we are so small. We can only do things, really in front of our eyes for the most part. We can put instruments down there, but even that requires us to be there. So I think it's just an appreciation for, this vast thing that, even with satellites, even with robots, we can see more than we used to, but a lot of it's still just about human beings putting themselves at risk, diving, getting this training, having the skills to go there.
And it is now a familiar sight, President Trump at his desk, wielding his pen, issuing executive orders. But what exactly are the legal implications of this signing spree? Gillian Metzger is a constitutional law professor at Columbia Law School and has previously served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General. And she joins Walter Isaacson now to decipher the actions that we've seen so far and what comes next.
Thank you, Christian, and Professor Gillian Metzger. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
President Trump has embarked on sort of a wide-ranging assault on the bureaucracy, shutting down agencies, cutting spending. It was pretty much what he was elected to do, and Congress has offered no real pushback. So what's wrong with what he's doing?
Well, there's several things that are concerning about what he's doing. I mean, I think what we're seeing is really a remarkable assertion of executive power. Our system is not one where the president is supposed to be governing single-handedly. Many of the actions that the president has taken certainly appear to be acting in the face of governing statutes, some instances at odds with the Constitution. So I think his actions so far do raise some pretty serious rule of law concerns.
Wait, let's go to the in defiance of the Constitution. Give me a couple of examples.
Well, for example, his executive order on birthright citizenship is very hard to square, to put it mildly, with the 14th Amendment, and has been enjoined already on that basis. Some of the claims that we may see in some of the actions on funding may reflect a very capacious view of the president having an inherent power to not spend, which is not a power that has been recognized. And in fact, the Constitution very strongly gives the power of the purse to Congress. So that would be another area where concern about his actions not working with the constitutional framework has arisen.
Let's drill down on that power not to spend, whether it be sequestering, impoundment, or just not spending money that's been appropriated by Congress. That seems a somewhat murky, although there have been cases about it, area. To what extent can the executive branch just say, okay, this is wasteful money, we're not going to spend it?
You really have to look at there is actually a very reticulated legal framework that governs spending. There is in the Constitution the grant of the spending power to Congress, and also the appropriations clause that says that the executive branch cannot make spending without an appropriation from Congress. The two things that really reiterate why Congress is the main constitutional actor.
But that says they can't make spending without appropriation, but can they just not spend some money that's been appropriated if they think it's wasteful?
Right. So when you're talking about not spending, you're still actually acting in violation of a statute, because the statute, the appropriation statute, grants the funds. And if it's a statute that doesn't grant discretion about how they are expended, or if the executive branch is acting in a way that's at odds with the terms of that statute, you still have a violation of Congress's control over funding. There's also a background statute, which dates back to 1974. And was enacted in response to the last president who ever raised this kind of broad attack on spending, which was President Richard Nixon. And it's the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, and it very significantly restricts the occasions on which the executive branch can refuse to spend money that has been appropriated by Congress.
So let's say he doesn't spend money, or the bureaucracy doesn't, or an agency doesn't spend money. What's the legal recourse? Does Congress have to sue to stop it? Can an ordinary citizen sue to stop that?
Well, we've had a couple of lawsuits already, by one by a group of states and one by a group of nonprofits, both of which were affected by the funding freeze in terms of having funds that they were expecting or relying on taken away. And so that gives them, in that sense, standing. And the claims that they have raised are attacks on the action as being arbitrary and capricious, because these were lawsuits aimed particularly at the OMB memo in part, and the lack of explanation in that very brief memo for this categorical across the board pause in funding is what they're targeting as arbitrary and capricious, and also because of the lack of statutory authority on the part of the executive branch to just pause funding, which again, Congress has required. I mean, there might be some, no doubt there are some statutes that are affected by the spending pause that in fact do give some discretion to the executive branch. But again, the pause was enacted in such a categorical across the board way that it really, you can't tie it to those specific statutes. It's a real deviation from the way appropriations and spending has been treated in the past.
Does it matter if Congress, let's say it just rolls over, as it seems to be doing at the moment?
I think it does matter. You can do lawsuits, and lawsuits, so in this case, there were very quick temporary injunctions put in place. But, fundamentally, it's going to have to be Congress that's going to be defending its core constitutional prerogatives. And so far, we really haven't seen that. And we're going to need to see it in order to really enforce the constitutional framework.
Well, let's go over some of the specific things. There's USAID, the Agency for International Development, Foreign Aid, and he wants to either decimate it or shut it down or roll it into the State Department. Is that legal?
I don't believe it is from what I've seen so far. The most basic problem is that USAID is an agency that was created by Congress. Congress has the authority to create agencies, not the executive branch. If Congress creates an agency, then it's going to take action by Congress to decreate an agency. The appropriation statutes for fiscal year 2024 do allow the executive branch to do some reorganization, but only if the executive branch consults with Congress first and actually prohibits the use of any funds that go to the State Department or USAID for a reorganization where there hasn't been that kind of consultation with Congress. So this action seems to be really flying in the face of that statutory framework.
Let's take another one, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That also seems to have been rolled into the Treasury Department. The new Treasury Secretary is now in charge, and he's basically, I won't say shutting it down, but dismantling it a lot. What's wrong with that, since that was also something Trump ran on saying he was going to do?
I mean, just because he runs on it doesn't mean that he gets to do it if it's at odds with governing statutes, right? That's kind of the fundamental principle that's underlying a lot of these lawsuits is, trying to ensure that the executive branch actions go forward in accordance with governing statutes. For the CFPB, you'd want to look at the statute creating the agency and assess whether or not this was a power that Treasury had. The CFPB was initially created as an independent agency with very strong independence protections, many of which it still has in terms of, for example, having a budget that's independent and independently funded. So the question would be in all of these cases, whether or not the action that the executive branch is asserting is really compatible with the governing statutes. And that's what courts are looking at.
All of this seems part of a larger dispute, one that we know the Supreme Court's going to have to resolve on whether the executive is sort of unitary and that the president can do whatever he wants with the executive branch. Explain that theory and the sense you have of the Supreme Court, which seems to be somewhat more supportive of that theory than previous courts.
Yeah, it certainly is. So the unitary executive theory emphasizes that the executive power under the Constitution is vested in a president, a single president, and emphasizes that he, under this theory, gets to exercise all of the executive power, which is then understood to mean not simply supervise the exercise of executive authority by all of the different employees and departments and agencies that Congress creates in the executive branch using Congress's own constitutional powers, but instead it seemed to me the president sort of has the authority to make the decisions, and in particular to remove officials exercising executive power. Particularly so far, the court has emphasized that at the high level, right? So we're talking, in particular, for example, the CFPB director, a principal officer in the executive branch who has a 5-year term. So this Supreme Court has taken a broad view of presidential authority and asserted this unitary executive view, particularly in the context of challenges to removal restrictions. So far, the court has not overturned a leading precedent going back to 1935 that does allow removal protections for a multi-member independent-headed agency, for example, or for inferior officers who don't have significant policymaking authority.
Well, anyway, get specific on that. Like, is that the National Labor Relations Board and Trump fired a Democrat on it? Is that what you're talking about?
Right. Well, so the National Labor Relations Board commissioner would be a principal officer. And the question, if that goes forward, and I believe a lawsuit has been filed, the question that will be raised is that removal was not in keeping with the governing statute and removal protections, and whether or not those protections intrude on the president's ability to take care of the executive branch and on his ability to remove high-ranking executive branch officials. In its recent decisions, again, the court has retained this earlier precedent that allowed removal protections for multi-member boards that are sort of divided on partisan grounds, as the NLRB is, whether or not it will conclude that the NLRB exercises too much executive authority, or that the protections against removal in that statute are too great, or decide to overturn that earlier precedent, is one of the things the litigation will show.
This is part of the larger movement that started with the overturning of what's known as the Chevron deference, which means that you kind of defer to agencies, unelected agencies, to make rules and regulations, to do what Congress does. Tell me how that fits into what I guess the Trump people would call overreach by the federal bureaucracy and their desire to trim that ability back.
What Chevron basically said was that if an agency is charged with implementing a statute, then a court should defer to the agency's interpretation of an ambiguous statute if that interpretation is reasonable. And in that sense, yes, it gave agencies deference for their interpretations of statutes on the grounds that Congress had implicitly delegated authority to them by having them be the implementer of these statutes. Interestingly, we have a president and administration right now that are making very bold assertions of executive power. And in fact, what we see with the Roberts Court is that they've been a little bit skeptical about some of these broad assertions of executive power. And in particular, if the Trump administration is asserting particular views of governing statutes under the overturning of Chevron, they will no longer get deference for those views. So whether or not the Roberts Court approach to agency authority and its assertion of judicial power to review agency interpretations ends up fitting with the agenda of the Trump administration, which wants to assert executive power in its own right, is something we still have to see.
So to simplify that a bit, what you're saying is that the decision, which conservatives cheered, of not allowing the agencies too much deference when they make regulations, could come back and hurt what Trump is trying to do, which is let some of these appointees of his in these agencies scale things back radically.
Yeah, I mean, because at the end of the day, it is going to be courts determining whether or not agencies have authority to do the actions they want to do without giving them deference. And Chevron was always a doctrine that served the interest of the administration in power in terms of giving it deference. So we will see whether or not it comes back to bite a little bit the Trump administration.
I want to talk about DOGE, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which was established by transforming the U.S. digital service, run by Elon Musk. It's been given a lot of access, including to the Treasury payment systems, maybe read-only access, the Secretary of Treasury says. Is there something illegal or wrong with that, in your opinion?
Well, I think there are some real concerns that have been raised. There's some real Privacy Act concerns. There's some real concerns about sort of just lack of accountability. These are systems that are very closely held, and access to them is stringently limited. And so it's concerning to think that they are being made open more generally. There has been litigation, a lawsuit again filed, and this is, I think, the theme of my remarks, but raising the Privacy Act challenge to some of what some of the access that has been granted.
Elon Musk has been called a special government employee. What does that mean, and is he subject to the conflict of interest rules in government?
So special government employees are a category of employee that are statutorily authorized. The critical feature is that they are officers or employees whose tenure is expected to be temporary and limited to 130 days out of any 365-day period. They are subject to the many of the conflict of interest requirements and the financial disclosure requirements. They have some exemptions from some requirements, and they may not need to file publicly on the financial disclosure front, depending on how many days they are employed. But they are subject to those restrictions.
And who's supposed to enforce those restrictions?
Well, those are restrictions that are generally enforced, for example, by the Office of Government Ethics and by others in the administration.
And can the Trump administration and President Trump himself decide how those will be enforced?
Well, I mean, again, a kind of core responsibility of the president is to take care that the law be faithfully executed. And that is an obligation that the president and leaders of the executive branch historically have taken quite seriously. So if a statute requires disclosure, then I would assume that an administration would take that seriously.
Over the past 20 or 30 years, presidents have been using executive authorities and orders and just expanding presidential power. Congress has been deferring, the courts have been deferring. Has the president had this much authority ever before in our history? And is this a trend that Trump is just accelerating?
Well, certainly you're absolutely right. We've been on a path of expanding executive authority, in part given some of the political divides in the country and as a result of difficulty that Congress has had in terms of taking on major issues and enacting legislation. I think that what we're seeing with the Trump administration is in some ways a following on an expansion on that trend. The degree to which the current administration appears to be willing to act in the face of governing statutes and the face of the Constitution is, I think, a distinctive trait, and one that is particularly alarming and worth highlighting. But the overall expansion of presidential authority has been going on for a while.
Professor Gillian Metzger, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The US-China rivalry, while President Trump pushes traditional allies away and cuts crucial tech and science funding to American universities, China is poised to make hay, even perhaps take over America's superpower status one day. But our next guest believes there is a way to stop that. It's all in his new book, Breakneck: China's Quest to Engineer the Future. Technology analyst Dan Wang joins Walter Isaacson to discuss his new framework for understanding Beijing.
Thank you, Christian, and Dan Wang. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Walter.
I was reading your book, Breakneck, last night, and there's a sentence at the very beginning that I think sets up the theme. Let me read it to you. You're talking about the contrast between America and China. You say, there's an American elite made up mostly of lawyers excelling at obstruction versus a Chinese technocratic class made up mostly of engineers that excels at construction. Tell me how that sets up your book and what you're arguing.
Walter, the central idea of my book is that China is a country that I call an engineering state because at various points, the entirety of the most senior members of the Communist Party have had degrees in engineering. What do engineers like to do? Well, build a lot of stuff, whether that is roads or bridges or hyperscalers or coal plants, whatever it is, homes especially. China is always trying to build another big project. The unfortunate fact of China is that they're not only physical engineers, they're also social engineers. And so they often treat society as if it were just another building material to be remolded and torn down as they wish. And I contrast that with the United States, which I call the lawyerly society, part because so many presidents have gone to law school. There are now 47 US senators with law degrees. Only one has studied anything in STEM. And the issue with lawyers is that they're really good at saying no rather than building stuff. And so we don't have really terrible ideas like the one-child policy in the United States, but we also don't have functional infrastructure, I would say, almost anywhere.
Well, you talk about the one-child policy, and I assume you mean in China. That was a social engineering thing. So what you're saying is they can build high-speed rail really great, but then when they start doing social engineering like one-child policy, that messes up.
That's right. So I think the unfortunate fact of China is that they cannot restrain themselves from being only physical engineers. I think for the most part, physical engineering, though it has a lot of costs, is pretty good. I think it is pretty good to have an expanding high-speed rail network, expanding subway systems, more homes than people can buy, such that they have falling home prices now. And I think there's plenty of problems around debt. There's plenty of problems around demographics. Sometimes there's human displacement involved, especially if they build a really big dam. But I think for the most part, that is good. The unfortunate thing is that sometimes they treat many of their ethno-religious minorities, like the folks living in Tibet or in Xinjiang, as just another building material. I spent a lot of time thinking about the one-child policy, as well as zero COVID, which I lived through during its entirety in China, in which the number is right there in the name. There's very little ambiguity about what these policies could possibly mean.
Is there something connected to that, though? In other words, could you have the great engineering skills without it slopping over into messy social engineering?
I want to get to a place much more like the Europeans, where the Europeans, perhaps the Japanese, have ended up in. In Europe, in, let's say, Paris, in Barcelona, and Rome, according to the subway costs that we have seen, according to the transit data that's mostly compiled by New York University, what we see is that these cities are able to build new infrastructure systems, new subway systems at about 1/8 or 1/9 the cost levels of New York City. And if I'm thinking about the populations in Barcelona and Madrid and Rome and Paris, they don't seem to be really deeply distressed by all of these human rights violations that were involved in building their subways. And so I think there's a way in which the Europeans and the Japanese have got it right. They have the high-speed rail systems, they have mass transit systems, perhaps they don't have quite enough housing, but they're much better than New York and California are at building. And what I'd like to say is that let's get to European levels. We don't have to do any social engineering, but let's have much more functional infrastructure that's badly needed in the United States.
You said we don't have to do any social engineering, but there seems to be a mindset in the United States that's not just lawyerly, it's not in my backyard stopping things. And you mention high-speed rail often, you put it in your book. In 2008, they approved a high-speed rail, I think, from Los Angeles to San Francisco. They also, in China, approved in 2008 one from Beijing to Shanghai. Tell me why it is that the U.S. one could never get built.
3 years after 2008, in 2011, the Shanghai-Beijing high-speed rail line started operating. It moves really quickly. It transports a lot of people. And over the course of the first decade, according to Chinese state media, the high-speed rail system moved something like 1.4 billion passenger trips over the course of the next decade. How many people have actually been able to ride on the California high-speed rail system? That answer is very simple. It is zero, because almost none of it has actually been built. The first segment that would be built would is supposed to open its lines in something between 2030 to 2033, connecting the towns of Bakersfield and Merced, which is not really close to San Francisco and Los Angeles. And this is one of these quite disappointing things about the United States, that the California high-speed rail has not built on time. It's basically built very little at all. And yet people aren't super disappointed. People aren't out on the streets saying, what's going on with our tax dollars? Right now, this whole system is supposed to cost something like $128 billion. And so that is kind of a strange thing to me.
Well, wait, let's get at the reason there. I mean, you say it's lawyers, but you know, our founders were lawyers. Most of the people who signed the Declaration, we used to be able to build things. What's gone wrong?
The lawyers have always been present in the U.S., but I think the character of the lawyers has changed quite substantially, essentially in the last 50, 60 years. In my book, I trace out that the U.S. has a heritage of being an engineering state. The U.S. certainly built a lot of stuff, much as the Chinese have. Between around the 1850s to around the 1950s, America built these awesome infrastructure projects, things like canal systems, transcontinental railroad, skyscrapers in Manhattan, as well as Chicago. We had the Manhattan Project, we had the Apollo missions, we had the interstate highway system. And I think that's in part because the technocratic engineering elites in America, sometimes represented by the military-industrial complex, had been in power a little bit more. And there was also the case that the lawyers were slightly different as well. If we take a look at lawyers about 100 years ago, they were much more often creative deal makers. So we had people like Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was kind of a Wall Street lawyer who packed his cabinet in the New Deal with other lawyers. And they were very effective and creative in thinking about how to structure new deals in order to get things done. Something really shifted in the 1960s and the 1970s when people had gotten really tired of all of these big engineering projects that the US had been managing. Things like the high-speed rail system, in which urban planners like Robert Moses rammed through too many highways through New York City. People were really exhausted by the war. People were really exhausted by DDT and other pesticides. And the lawyers themselves turned away from deal makers into much more regulators as well as litigators. And I think that is what we're living with the remnants of, lawyers that are much more eager to stop things rather than build things.
You were born in Yunnan province, I think in southwest China. And when you were young, you moved to Canada, but then you moved back to Shanghai during and happened to be there when COVID struck. Tell me what you learned by being there during COVID.
I was in China from 2017 to 2023, in which I experienced the first trade war that President Trump launched. I saw how that morphed into much greater geopolitical tensions between the US and China. My centerpiece for living in China was experiencing the entirety of zero COVID from 2020 to the end of 2022. And zero COVID started out in a kind of a political disaster in which people had gotten really upset that a respiratory virus had been spilling out of Wuhan in the start of 2020, in which people were reminded that only 2 decades before the start of COVID, that China had a different respiratory virus, namely SARS in 2003, in which the government suppressed a lot of news and then suppressed a lot of whistleblowers, and then the virus was allowed to spread because people weren't really allowed to know about it. And people had gotten quite angry. But then there was a next stage of COVID's development in which China implemented all of these World Health Organization guidelines to really try to stop the transmission of the virus, sometimes through fairly coercive means. But what that did achieve was a level of transmissions that was almost non-existent, that was absolutely minuscule, and the ability to restart life in a pretty compelling way. And that worked pretty well up until the spring of 2022, when we had the much more transmissible Omicron variant of the virus, in which the Chinese state tried to use these same methods to try to contain a much more transmissible virus and was not successful. So we had the Shanghai lockdown, which took place in the spring of 2022, in which I say that the state attempted probably the most ambitious lockdown in the history of humanity, in which China's largest city, Shanghai, of 25 million people, were unable to leave their apartment compounds over the course of 8, 9, 10 weeks. And so I think one of the messages I want to convey with the engineering state is that the line between rationality and irrationality is pretty thin. It could look like China is achieving these spectacular successes up until it goes too far and holds on for too long, in which case it veers into disaster. And so that is one of these strange paradoxes that we see with China and the engineering state.
One of the things you did when you were back living in China is you took a bicycle trip. I think it was through Guizhou province. And it's a somewhat poor province, and yet you saw a lot of things that I think informed the rest of your book.
It's a very poor province. It's far deep in China's southwest, where it is highly mountainous, a lot of jungles, and previously a lot of diseases that arose from malaria. So by way of context, Guizhou is very distant from the much more prosperous coasts of China, which are much richer because they are able to export a lot of goods. Because Guizhou is so distant and so mountainous, it just hasn't been able to get much industry started. So this is China's fourth poorest province. And yet, when I took that bicycle trip in the summer of 2021, I saw astounding levels of infrastructure. Guizhou has about 11 airports, with 4 more under construction. Guizhou has excellent integration into the high-speed rail network. Its cities have very good subway lines. Guizhou also has about 45 of the world's tallest bridges. Not China's tallest bridges, but the world's tallest bridges. And so I was really struck that when I was traveling through, America's equivalent of, let's say, West Virginia or maybe a South Dakota, not the most wealthy places, that it has much better levels of infrastructure than
let me stop right there. How do they afford that? Are they taking on too much debt to do that?
They are taking a lot of debt to be able to do that, and they're barely able to afford that. Perhaps they're not able to afford it because we can see that Guizhou is one of the most indebted provinces in China. A lot of these local governments are unable to pay back the interest on their bonds that they used to build these big bridges that are not terribly economical. And I think that is definitely one of these big problems of the engineering state, that they don't care enough about profitability. They pile on a lot of debt. But when I was cycling through Guizhou and chatting to some of these folks who are living in these villages, for the most part, they are really proud of everything that they see around them. That previously it took them hours to get to their neighboring village, but now with this new bridge, it takes them a matter of minutes, perhaps, in order to drive across this bridge. They feel really good that they have the high-speed rail lines in which they're able to go to much bigger cities like Shanghai or Beijing, perhaps, to work. And so that is something that I think the engineering state has been really good at, that a lot of what it builds is perhaps economically questionable, but what that has also achieved is a degree of political resilience. And I think building a lot of infrastructure inspires genuine pride with a lot of Chinese, and I think that goes some length to explaining why the Communist Party has been robust and has been as stable as it is, because people are really happy to get better cities, better parks, more subway lines, better integration, and they are very genuinely proud of these big monumental projects.
Let me ask you a philosophical question, because a lot of what you've been talking about involves America's emphasis on individual freedom, individual rights, the rights to stop things or whatever, things that you do not see in Chinese society, whether it's a lockdown in Shanghai or data privacy. To what extent is individual freedom a detriment to America's ability to build things, and to what extent might it actually be the secret sauce that allows more innovation in America?
I think it is both. I think it is both the secret sauce as well as some extent detriment. Now, I want to say that part of the reason that I moved out of China at the start of 2023 was because I missed some degree of individualism, that I wanted to be left alone by the state and not suffer these dramatic crackdowns and lockdowns that a lot of Chinese had been experiencing. I really miss the pluralism that exists in the US. And I think I'll say one nice thing about the lawyers is that they guarantee everyone's ability to have some sort of voice in the system. And I much appreciated that over the Chinese system, in which the official voice is really meant to speak above everyone else. At the same time, I think that there are issues that in the United States, especially in California in particular, there are all sorts of problems in which a single homeowner, a single property owner is able to put up his hand, hire a pretty expensive lawyer, and convince a judge not to do something that many, many other people desperately need. And I think what the US system has is this entrenched homeowner base, entrenched political base that is much more interested in protecting their own interests rather than building out more so that more people can share the goods. And a lot of what I want to do is to try to encourage the US to be slightly more engineering. Let's call it 20% more engineering, because that's what we need to build our homes and build our infrastructure. And I wish that China could be 50% more lawyerly. It needs a lot more lawyers in order to protect individual rights, in order to permit individual flourishing, allow some degree of creative expression. And I think that the world would really be better off if the US could build a little bit more again, and if the Chinese state could actually respect the wills and wishes of its own people.
Do you see similarities between President Xi of China and President Trump of the United States?
I certainly see that President Trump is learning a lot from President Xi. Yes, it is very often the case that Trump is saying all sorts of nice things about his buddy, Xi Jinping. I've heard him praise Xi's great head of hair. I think that is a really remarkable thing to say about another world leader. And part of my concern is that rather than learning all of the good things that China has been doing well, I worry that the United States is learning a lot of really bad things. I think that Trump is learning to be like China, to be visiting a lot of misfortune upon the downtrodden, upon some of the most unfortunate among us. There's now much greater questions around data probity, which is an issue among the statistical agencies now in both the US as well as in China. in which I think the top leader demands a lot of fealty, and every problem is caused by either foreigners or traitors. And I think these are all things that Trump has been learning from Xi. And I would really hope that Trump can learn some of the good stuff, because right now I think it feels to me like we have authoritarianism without the good stuff. The good stuff of functioning cities, functioning logistical systems, public order, as well as very extensive infrastructure build-outs that we need very much. And so rather than learning the good stuff, I think it's unfortunate that Trump is learning mostly the bad stuff.
Dan Wang, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.
If I were to pose a question about significant figures in Russian history, who would spring to mind? You might think of well-known leaders like Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, or President Putin. But how many of you could name the women who stood alongside them? A new book written by our next guest, Russian-American writer Julia Ioffe, confronts the forgotten narratives of these women and places their remarkable stories in the spotlight. Ioffe joins Michel Martin to discuss Russia's complex history of motherhood, marriage, and much more.
Thanks, Christiane. Julia Ioffe, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
Your new book, Motherland, is so interesting. It looks through modern Russian history, Soviet and Russian history, but through the lens of the women. How did you get the idea to do that?
Well, the first germ of the idea was to write a book that wasn't about Vladimir Putin. I was so tired of talking about him, writing about him, thinking about him, and I wanted to write a book about Russia that wasn't about him. And then I realized I wanted it to not be about most of the men that we read so much about. The Vladimir Lenins, the Joseph Stalins, the Nikita Khrushchevs. And then the other part of the idea came from the fact that I was constantly having to explain to American friends, to Western friends, why it was so normal for women like my great-grandmothers to be doctors in the 1930s and scientists. And something that seemed completely extraordinary to them was totally ordinary to me. And so to bridge that gap, I realized I had to tell the story of the whole thing.
You write about this extraordinary social revolution that followed 1917. Soviet women were, quote, given the right to higher education, equal pay, no-fault civil divorce, child support, including for children born out of wedlock, paid maternity leave, and access to free maternity hospitals. And in 1920, the Soviet Union legalized abortion. How did that happen?
Well, the new Soviet authorities, the Bolshevik authorities, wanted to emancipate women, and they wanted to destroy the bourgeois family, which they felt imprisoned women. It was part of their project to remake society, starting from the individual, to remake a Soviet person. And if you think about where they were coming from, in the 19th century, women married mostly for economic reasons, right? They went from their father's house to their husband's house, and it was impossible to get out of that out of that marriage, even if there was abuse or cheating, or she just didn't want to be married to him anymore. There was nowhere to go. Women were expected to, working class women were expected to work through their pregnancies and come right back right after giving birth, right? I mean, you don't even have to think about the 19th century, right? We're still fighting for these rights here today, 100 years later.
I feel so embarrassed that I didn't know some of these names. Everybody knows Lenin. But who was Alexandra, how am I say it correctly, Kollontai?
Yeah, that's right.
Who was she? And tell us why she was such an important figure.
So she became an ally of Vladimir Lenin, and she voted with him in the Bolshevik Central Committee to seize power in October 1917, for which she was rewarded with a cabinet ministerial post. So she became the first female cabinet minister in history. But she was a writer and a thinker that really fleshed out the ideas of how to emancipate women specifically. Marxist writers, most of the men, wrote about how to get rid of capitalism, get rid of private property, and how this would just emancipate everyone. And Kollontai said, well, no, women do have specific needs. She wrote that the most important thing for a woman, the thing that gave her meaning in life, and gave her purpose on this earth wasn't getting married, wasn't having children, but her own work, her own creative labor. And she could get married if she wanted to. She could not. She could have a fling or an affair to drink from the cup of love until she was sated, as Kollontai wrote, and then get back to work. She wrote that in 1913. I think that is still a very controversial and radical statement today.
So I was fascinated by Raisa Gorbachev because, a lot of Americans had seen her because she traveled here with her husband. Just talk a little bit about her.
Raisa didn't really fit in at home. Soviets really hated her. They didn't like that she was so independent. They didn't like that she was one of her husband's closest advisors. She helped him write his speeches. She was with him on foreign trips everywhere. It was really jarring for Soviets to see her when they had been used for decades to seeing only old male faces at the top. She was stylish and kind of running around the world at a time when Soviet women couldn't find clothes or food to eat. They didn't have menstrual products. They didn't have bras. They gave birth in filthy conditions in these maternity hospitals that were just horrific, as I describe in the book. And they certainly couldn't travel abroad the way she did. And she enchanted a lot of people in the West, including American feminists who said, "Oh, look at her! She's this amazing working woman who has it all. She's a wife, a mother, a grandmother, as well as a college professor, a PhD, and she's still so feminine. How does she do it?" Where Soviets were like, Soviet women were like, our lives look nothing like hers, and we hate her for rubbing it in our faces.
Then we get to Putin, and I know you said you didn't want the book to be about Putin. It's not, but it's about his, because he does take up a lot of space. That was one of the most depressing chapters where you about why they dated for years before they actually married, which is unusual at the time. And he kind of made it clear that, she was there to kind of be his administrative officer and raise the kids and do whatever, but didn't give her any kind of support or affection from what we see at all. Why don't you just tell me a little bit about her?
So Lyudmila Putina, who is now Lyudmila Chiretna, because she's done okay. She's married a man 10 years her junior. For her silence, she has gotten lots and lots of money. She has mansions all over Europe, including Belarus. Okay. She's doing fine. Okay. But Lyudmila Putina was born in Kaliningrad, which is kind of this outcropping of Russia in the middle of Europe. And she had an alcoholic father. She lived in a communal apartment. She dropped out of technical college and became a flight attendant. And she met Vladimir Putin when they were in their early 20s. And she at first thought he was quite unremarkable, but then she came to really admire him because he was so unlike other men their age. He didn't drink. He was physically fit. He was disciplined. He was focused. He was decisive. And in a generation that was born after World War II, when there weren't a lot of men around, and the men that were around were kind of broken psychologically, alcoholic. I mean, alcoholism took off like crazy after World War II because of all the trauma people suffered. And he just struck such a contrast that she was like, this is a real man, and I want to cede some of the responsibilities that Russian women have. So when he starts making every single decision for them, and she has absolutely no agency in the relationship, she really finds it comforting and reassuring because she doesn't feel like she's carrying everything. But then, of course, quickly, once they actually do get married, after he strings her along for 3 years, once they do have kids, she realizes it's all completely on her.
In fact, the most disturbing story is then she was in a car accident and wakes up in the hospital and...
Sure. Vladimir Putin is called. He's now the second man in the city. This is now post-communist St. Petersburg. He races over to the hospital. They're like, oh, she's going to be fine. And he says, okay, and leaves without seeing her, which is just incredible.
Which
in the worst way. But it was, to me, it was so him, right? It was before he was really in the public eye, and the kind of the coldness, the cruelness, the withholding of warmth and affection, the little things we see him do, these little power plays, like when he made the Pope wait 45 minutes. With Ludmila, he was late to every single date by about an hour and a half. And she still came back for more.
And why did she put up with this?
Well, because men were so scarce after the war. And this really traumatized Russian women who were also being told that they have to get married young and have children young, because the Soviet government started telling them this because they needed to replace all the people they had killed. About 50 million people that were killed in just, 30 years? So there was this obvious absence of men, of eligible men to marry, and it was just like, I'll take him.
So then let's go to the present day. You're right. 100 years after Kollontai and Lenin railed against traditional, economically motivated marriage as a prison for Russian women, it had become their ultimate fantasy. And the evidence of that is in other chapters in the book, where you talk about these wives of oligarchs, these former wives of oligarchs, and this mad, I don't know what to call it, like Hunger Games match for these men. How did that happen?
So what happened is the Soviet government, in fighting part of one world war and all of a second world war, a civil war, having mass famines and putting down peasant rebellions and having mass political repressions, killed a lot of men. By the end of 1945, there were so few men in some places that there would be 19 of them for every 100 women. And at the same time, the Soviet Union really wanted a baby boom, the kind that the U.S. was having, because they needed to, as they said, replace the dead. And there were villages in Russia where only one man came back from the war, and his wife would pass her husband around so that the other women in the village could become mothers as well. So this combination of the state telling women they need to become mothers, that this is their, unlike what Kollontai was saying, that their main role in life, their sole purpose in life was to become mothers. When there were so few men around, how do you do that? So it creates this mismatch between supply and demand.
But you also write about the connection to the way wealth is achieved in Russia, and just this tremendous sort of economic dislocations that have occurred since the fall of communism. Would you talk, which are two different stories, but they're kind of related. So would you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Like the drinking, right? The drinking, it doesn't come from nowhere.
That's right. So basically, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, with it collapsed the teetering Soviet economy. Factories closed, mines closed, and parts of the Soviet government closed, and men and women responded very differently. Men said, I was a factory foreman, or I was an engineer. I will not do lower status work. I'm going to sit around and be sad and complain and wait for work of my status, of my station to come back online. And the women didn't have that option. And they took to drink because they were depressed and, stressed out. The women didn't have that option because for the last 50 years, parenthood had become motherhood. Motherhood became all of parenthood. Fathers weren't expected to father their children and parent them in any way. So women didn't have this option, and they had to work really hard, wash floors, schlep rags from Turkey to sell in markets, chop chicken parts to keep their families fed, while the men just lay down, took to drink, and drank themselves to death, which again exacerbated this perceived shortage of men. And at the same time, there was this new oligarchic class coming into being, and they were all men. And they had such fantastical wealth that plus all the imagery coming in from the West, there was this idea of like, wouldn't it be wild and amazing to be a stay-at-home wife and a mom? So instead of being a Soviet woman who has to work full time, do 7 hours of housework per day, and take care of the kids full time while the man just maybe works, the idea was, well, can I just be a mom?
You know, these pictures of Putin, you know, bare-chested, you know, shirtless on horseback, or Putin, you know, fishing or playing hockey, where magically he scores all the goals. In the West, we think this is hilarious.
Yeah.
You know, we're like, what is this? Like, what's this guy? You were saying that in Russia, this is actually part of his allure, and that it's actually directed at the women.
Yes.
Because the women find this, comforting in a way. Like, say more about that.
Yeah, so because Russian men are seen as so useless, as these kind of overgrown man-children that the women have to take care of in addition to their actual children, you know, they can't be trusted with the money. They earn more than the women, but, you know, can they be trusted to bring it home? Can they be trusted not to drink through everything, not to get into a crazy car accident or just drop dead at work? Russian men die so much younger than Russian women. They're in such terrible health and in such terrible shape. They smoke, they drink, they eat a lot of mayonnaise salads. And Putin is so not that. He doesn't drink. He exercises regularly, and on camera, he makes sure people see it. He makes sure to show people how disciplined he is, how much longer he's lived than the average Russian man. And for a lot of Russian women, he is the man they never had, and the man they wish they had, which also goes back to your question about why did Lyudmila Putina stick with him for as long as she did? Because, yeah, he was maybe not the nicest partner, but at least he was there, and he had this kind of traditional, virile, energetic image, whereas the average Russian man is seen as this drunken, childish slob.
I doubt that Motherland is going to be, you know, a bestseller in Russia. I don't know that we'll be seeing too many copies in the airport bookstore. But I'm wondering, what are people saying about it?
The reaction I'm getting from Russians is very positive. A lot of them, the ones that were able to read it in English, didn't know a lot of this history. I didn't know most of this history, and it's just not taught. What Russians are taught, what I was taught studying Soviet and Russian history here in the U.S. is a very male-centric history. And I didn't know about Alexandra Kollontai, for example, until I started researching this book. A lot of, you know, I kept giving chapters to my parents to read, to ask them, or to other friends from the kind of Russia sphere to read, like, did you know any of this? Or am I just repeating something everybody else has said? And most people didn't know any of this. So people are pleasantly surprised and have found it illuminating. But yeah, we're working on getting it translated into Russian, so at least it can get into the country digitally. But, you know, I have a friend who runs a publishing house in Russia, and she said there's no way with the word feminist. And it's not because of the way Putin is portrayed, but because it has feminist on the cover. And she said, you know, at a time when Susan Sontag's books are being seized by police from stores, there's no way.
Julia Ioffe, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Michelle.
Now, despite lengthy negotiations, it appears the war Russia launched against Ukraine is no closer to ending. Russian and American aides reported that 5 hours of conversations in Moscow earlier this week produced progress, but during a visit to India, President Putin threatened to liberate the Donbass by military or other means, that is, eastern Ukraine. A Ukrainian delegation heads to Florida to meet with U.S. officials in a bid for a ceasefire and a fair deal. Joshua Yaffa, a contributing writer for The New Yorker, has reported on the war since 2022, and he joins Michelle Martin to discuss what it would take to stop it.
Thanks, Christian. Joshua Yaffa, thank you so much for talking with us once again.
Thanks for having me.
You know, we talked at the beginning of this conflict, the beginning of this kind of Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine. Are you surprised we're having the same conversation 4 years later?
Hard to think back to those early days of the war when I was in Kiev and we spoke. I think I was actually in a subway station overnight, sheltering with other residents of the city, where actually many residents of Kiev still go these nights to shelter from Russian air attacks. So there is a kind of sad, tragic Groundhog Day nature to the conflict and how it feels, certainly for the people in Ukraine. Really, the dynamics of the war, why the war started and how the war might end, have stayed remarkably constant, which essentially is Russia, Vladimir Putin seek to severely limit, if not negate, Ukrainian sovereignty, to limit both politically, certainly militarily, the kind of potential Ukraine has to chart its own course, especially if that means growing closer with the West, either politically, above all, militarily through NATO. So that's something that Putin seeks to not just limit, but essentially take off the table for generations to come. It's a kind of historical project for him. And Ukraine looks to preserve that sovereignty, right? Looks to preserve its sovereign right to chart its own historical path, culturally, politically, militarily, right? The military aspect actually is seen as a way of protecting those other realms. And so what Putin seeks to achieve, his kind of ultimate strategic war aims, are exactly what Ukraine considers anathema and sort of non-starters, something it can't agree to as it understands for the kind of survival of the nation. And so we're at loggerheads, right? We're at a war that grinds on, each side thinking that a bit more time can improve its position, mainly because it will exhaust its opponent. And that's really the kind of the grinding logic of the war of attrition we're still stuck in 4 years later. So
one of the reasons we're speaking now is that we're in the midst of kind of a flurry of diplomatic moves. The President Trump's envoys, Steve Witkoff, a former golf buddy of his, a fellow real estate developer, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, they just concluded this, sort of hours-long session. NATO is meeting without the United States, interestingly enough. And the Ukrainian president has been kind of back and forth to Europe, trying to shore up support there. This comes after this lengthy sort of peace proposal was put on the table, ostensibly crafted by the United States, but it's emerged that it was very much initially based on Russia's sort of talking points. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, does this flurry of diplomacy mean anything to your knowledge in the context of what we've seen so far? Does it seem like it is any kind of an inflection point, or is it just another day?
There are some new dynamics, right? Despite what we talked about a minute ago, and that the kind of overall, the logic of the war has remained constant. Of course, there are dynamics that come up. The most important one is Donald Trump as president of the United States, who has a dramatically different position regarding Russia. And I don't think we need to sort of go over, right, his history of conciliatory statements toward Putin. But I think ultimately what's most important is Trump's desire to end the war. If President Biden had a desire to end the war in a way that, as he and European partners understood it, would deliver some kind of both durable and just peace for Ukraine, Trump is interested in ending the war, getting a victory, a diplomatic victory, his Nobel Peace Prize, like, for example, was the case with the Gaza deal from last fall, where how the war ended was less important than the fact that it did end. And so then it flows from that it's only natural, if you're interested in speed, that you effectively put pressure on the weaker party, and that is Ukraine, right? And Ukraine is the weaker party for a number of reasons. Certainly just by looking at the battlefield dynamics, Russian army, just objectively, quantitatively, much larger. It's moving forward, and Ukraine is losing territory. At the same time, Ukraine is under increasing financial pressure. The Ukraine budget could really be running out of cash effectively. And the third point is a political crisis stemming from a corruption scandal in Ukraine that hits really close to Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president. People around him, his longtime chief of staff, right-hand man, Andrei Yermak, was forced to resign this week under the specter of a corruption allegation. So all of that comes together to put Ukraine in a much more difficult and vulnerable position. And it's that position that Russia hopes the Trump administration will effectively exploit, right? That the Trump administration will be so interested in a peace deal fast and kind of really twist Ukraine's arm. Putin thinks that time will bring him closer to victory. So as far as Putin sees it, either he gets the deal he wants or he doesn't and keeps fighting, and that will still get him closer to the deal he wants eventually.
So what does Putin want? This is one of the things that was interesting about this 28-point peace plan that was evidently, at least based on a kind of a transcript of a leaked phone call that was reported by Bloomberg, where the president's envoy, Steve Witkoff, was overheard speaking to his Russian counterpart and coaching him on how to win over President Trump. But one of the things that was interesting about this document is it really kind of laid out Russian objectives in black and white. What are they?
Well, first, I would caution a little bit of seeing the 28-point Witkoff plan as a kind of pure expression of Russian or Putin priorities. Certainly, there was Russian input. We know now about the genesis of that document. But my sources in Moscow, foreign policy circles, I wrote about this in the New Yorker last week, were actually cautious about that Witkoff document. These are kind of potentially some kind of attractive for Russia sounding proposals, but how are they implemented? How can Russia count on them? Politicians come and go. Even Trump, as one Moscow source told me, right, is a temporary political phenomenon, right? He could be out of office in 3 years, and just like U.S. policy shifted so dramatically from Biden to Trump, it could shift again. Now to the sort of core question, right? Mm-hmm. What Putin wants, and he's actually spoken about this quite openly, right? And what he thinks is that Ukraine has essentially become, he calls it, a quote, anti-Russian project, right? It's been led astray by the West, that its integration with Western political and certainly military structures like NATO, right, is the kind of ahistorical aberration. That's not Ukraine's place, and it's being kind of led out of Russia's rightful sphere of influence, and Russia simply cannot tolerate this, quote, anti-Russian project on Russian borders, that the idea that there would be foreign military bases, foreign troops stationed in Ukraine, with a Ukraine that is culturally and historically rejecting Russia, all of that feels like a kind of security threat as Putin sees it, that is simply a kind of non-starter, a non-starter for Russia, a non-starter for his own political legacy that he's trying to ensure. This is right. We're also dealing with an autocrat who's been in power for 26 years and counting. And I think that also kind of affects how he sees the world and his own place in Russian history. What this is not about is territory. It's not about lines on a map. It's not about, where are the borders drawn, who controls what city. All of those issues are proxies for Putin's real issue, which is that Ukraine simply cannot be allowed to be a threat as he defines it.
And why is the cost worth it to him? I mean, we've been reporting at NPR, we've reported that he's losing as many as 25,000 soldiers a month. What makes it worth that cost in lives?
What's important to remember is that Putin's initial calculation in launching this invasion was that the war would be quick, the Ukrainian army would crumble, he'd be in Kyiv in 3 days, right? So we have to understand that Putin has ended up in a protracted war that he never counted on, and either would have made different calculations or not launched the invasion if he knew. Who knows? Those are all in the realm of kind of hypotheticals. But he counted on something very different. What he's ended up in is a war of attrition. And the kind of grim, dark logic of a war of attrition is you win by having your opponent lose more. So everything you just said about loss of troops, cost to the economy, it's relative to how those factors are weighing on Ukraine, right? And Ukraine is a smaller country, economically, population, and there are large questions about Ukraine's ability to continue to field trained, equipped infantry, right? There's a huge problem with troops going AWOL, deserting in Ukraine, right? So the kind of the manpower question is very real in the Ukrainian army. And the financial question, according to some prognoses, Ukraine could be in serious financial deficit, really running out of cash to run the country by the first quarter of next year. Europe has Ukraine's chief financial backer. They can't seem to get a plan together. They can't seem to get this money to Ukraine. So getting back to your question, this war is incredibly, incredibly costly for Putin. He would like for it to end, but his calculation is that he can achieve his strategic objectives with time because things are actually worse for Ukraine. And it is Ukraine who will be forced to effectively bend the knee faster than Russia will run out of whether it's troops to fuel the war, money to fuel the war, and so on.
Let's talk about the European position. I mean, one of the arguments from the European side is that if Russia is rewarded or is successful in invading Ukraine, who's next? Could it be Poland? Could it be, Moldova? Who's next? And so the question is, why isn't there more urgency in Europe around supporting Ukraine, at least giving them the resources to resist?
That's a great question. One I ask often as a reporter myself who lives in Europe. I'm based in Berlin. I'm talking to you tonight from Warsaw. And of course, the view in Warsaw is very different than the view, let's say, in Budapest, Hungary, right, where Viktor Orban just recently went to Moscow to meet with Putin, or in a place like Portugal, Greece, right? Frontline states, as they're called, like Poland, have, of course, different view of this than states elsewhere in Europe. And that's part of the problem, right, is kind of how do you triangulate positions among these states that have different sense of urgency, different sense of priority. Some are trying to deal with their own domestic situations. There's little appetite in European populations for taking out, for going further into deficit, right? For taking out new loans, to essentially having new European taxpayers foot the bill for increased aid to Ukraine. But your point or your question really is absolutely the correct one, and I don't have an answer to it, right? The Europeans were so upset about the emergence of these 28 points and how it was done by a kind of end run around European states, European diplomats, didn't take into account European interests. Well, where is the European peace plan, right? I mean, if in a vacuum will be filled, perhaps in ways that you don't like, right? But I didn't see European diplomats out in front of a EU-led peace plan. There was an attempt to create one after Witkoff and the 28 points emerged, but that plan was quickly discarded effectively both by Russia and Trump. And it seems like Europe hasn't attempted since. And the point about the money, I think, gets to the real crux of the matter, which is European politicians say all the right things about the importance of supporting Ukraine, the strategic interest of making sure Ukraine doesn't lose this war, that Russian aggression cannot be rewarded. But where kind of does the rubber hit the road? You mentioned earlier that we don't need to go through the litany of conciliatory and even laudatory statements that, President Trump has made about Vladimir Putin over the years. But have we ever figured out why President Trump seems so disposed toward the Russian position and Vladimir Putin in particular? I've never been a fan, going back to 2016, 17, of the more kind of conspiratorial versions of this, right? I don't think there's any Russian compromat on Trump. I don't think he's afraid of, some tape that may have been made in the Ritz-Carlton many years ago that was, discussed almost a decade ago or so. Now, I think the answer is rather simple. One is that Putin is a legible, understandable kind of leader for Trump, right? That it's easier to deal with Putin, strongman, unitary power in his country. Also just the kind of man and the kind of leader that Trump, again, understands, admires, knows how to do business with. And in the current context, I mentioned this earlier, what Trump really wants is to be seen as the peacemaker in Ukraine. He just wants the war to be over. He wants to be able to go on Truth Social and say, I did it. I created peace in Ukraine. He wants his Nobel Prize. He wants, this aura like he got in Gaza of having ended the war. But if we remember in Gaza, right, it's a kind of peace plan with all of these other points to be negotiated later. Is that happening? I'm no expert on the Middle East. I don't want to speak to that. But, I think what Trump would like is something similar, which is the headline of peace. And the particulars of it can be dealt with later or maybe not at all. You've been in and out of Ukraine over the course of these years, and you've talked to people there all the time. Clearly, they're war weary. But do you have a sense of how they view the current situation? You just pointed out that there's just been body blow after body blow, some of them sort of self-inflicted, like this corruption scandal that you just mentioned. What is your sense of morale? Right. War weary, right, I think, is exactly the right way to put it. I mean, Kiev right now, which at various points in the war had been more or less relatively spared, at least a kind of semblance of normal life continued, and still does continue actually during the day. But, regular drone attacks at night, but more importantly for daily life, long stretches of blackout, hours at a time, 10 hours or so or more of rolling blackouts across the capital city of Ukraine. So of course that leads to, that sort of brings the war home and it leads to a new sense of exhaustion that even in the capital city, life is so impacted. You ask, however many million, tens of millions of Ukrainians about how the war should end, you'll get as many millions of responses. But generally, I think there really is a willingness to end the war, knowing that it's not going to end with a kind of resounding Russian defeat, that Ukraine gets all its territory back and joins NATO. Ukrainians understand that there's going to be an ugly deal to end this war. It's going to be ugly and it's going to be unfair for Ukraine, that the aggressor in some way will be rewarded. I think we're just objectively on that trajectory. What Ukrainians want above all is that a sense that for the sacrifices, certainly for the lives lost, both huge losses in the military, incredible losses that you, myself, other colleagues have documented among civilians, at least Ukraine gains. They're often talked about as security guarantees. What it really means is the confident hope that this will not happen again in 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, that there is a durable peace. And that means a Ukraine that is secure and sovereign over the medium and long term.
Before we let you go, what are you going to be keeping your eyes on over these next months?
Well, so Ukraine, to put it simply, in my estimation, is ready for compromise, real concessions, not capitulation, right? I think that's the key distinction. But Ukraine is really ready to make some painful concessions to end this war. Putin, on the other hand, is still insisting on his kind of maximalist goals. The question is, do those shift at all, right? Does Putin continue to insist on it's all or nothing for me, and I think that victory is just around the corner, so I'm going to keep on pressing? Does anything in his calculation change, right? Does he actually soften those maximalist goals? Does he understand that, okay, I'll take, 7 out of 10 of those points? Or perhaps he thinks, I'm actually not getting anywhere in advancing them, so I better cut a deal. Right now, there's no indication of either of those dynamics happening. But again, since Ukraine is willing to make a peace, willing to make a painful peace, actually, it's really the ball, so to speak, is in Putin's court, right? Does anything change in his calculus, either because of what's happening on the battlefield or the policies of Western states? For right now, the answer is no. But wars change in dynamic, unpredictable ways, and it's possible that the next weeks and months brings a different trajectory. Although, again, keeping in the sad theme of this conversation, I'm rather pessimistic. I wouldn't expect that, right? But that's something certainly to keep an eye on that could affect the dynamic.
Joshua Yaffa, thank you so much for talking with us once again.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we turn to the United States, where the Trump administration is creating a task force to identify federal lands suitable for building affordable homes. Now, the initiative marks a first step by the Trump White House to address one of the worst housing shortages in decades. That shortage is part of the focus of the new book, Abundance. Co-authors Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson join Walter Isaacson to discuss how the crises we see today can be traced back to the regulatory policies of previous generations.
Thank you, Paula and Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Walter. Great to be here.
So, Derek, a few years ago, you coined the words the abundance agenda, and now this book sort of builds on that. Tell me what you meant by the abundance agenda.
This was January 2022. And I was standing in line in Washington, D.C. in the frigid air, waiting on a COVID test, which at the time were being rationed during the Omicron outbreak. And I thought to myself, it's kind of crazy that we are now 2 years into a pandemic and we don't have enough COVID tests. And I was thinking about the experience of the pandemic. I thought it wasn't just that we don't have enough COVID tests. We don't or haven't had enough COVID vaccines. And before that, there was a scarcity of PPE for hospital workers. The pandemic, I thought, was really just this experience of one shortage after another. And as I zoomed out from the experience of the pandemic, I thought, it's not just this pandemic alone. It's really America in the 21st century that has dealt with one crisis of scarcity after another. There aren't enough homes, and as a result, affordability is a major crisis in American cities. We don't have enough clean energy construction in this country or many other countries, and that's one of the reasons why climate change has been so difficult to take down. And as I thought about all of the scarcities that have defined this modern age, I thought, well, what America needs most is the exact opposite. Not a reality of scarcity, but an agenda of abundance. And I thought this abundance agenda could take on housing to create an abundance of housing. It could take on clean energy. But far beyond that, you could look at all sorts of other blockages and bottlenecks in the economy, whether it's policies that limit the number of doctors we have or policies that make it harder for scientists to do their best work. We need to think about what an agenda for true American abundance would look like. And then yada, 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 we have a book.
So, Ezra, you've written a lot about this when it comes to housing, which is the core of this book in many ways. Really interesting part, including the shocking statistic that in the 1950s, housing was about twice as much as your annual salary. Now it'd be 6 times as much. Why is that?
Because in the places people want to live, we stop building homes. I mean, it's really that simple. I'm a Californian. I grew up in California. I went to public university in California. I then lived in DC for 13, 14 years and moved back to California, which is where I lived during a lot of the writing of this book. And Derek's experience of the pandemic has sort of been my experience of California. I love my home state. It is on the technological frontier. It is a cultural frontier. It is beautiful. So why is it losing hundreds of thousands of people every year to Texas, to Arizona, to Colorado, to Florida? And the answer is the working class can't afford to live there, right? These families are my friends, right? I was in San Francisco watching people have kids and have to move away because they couldn't afford a home in the city that often they did essential jobs to protect or to serve. And parts of the book that we wrote are futuristic. Parts of them are about how we pull the inventions we want in the future forward into the present. Those are things that we don't yet know how to build. But there's no technical problem around building apartment buildings. The question of how to construct a house is solved. What is the issue here is politics, is process, is the ability to get people to say yes, and frankly, the process where you have to have so many people say yes along the way. And you've been looking at other problems in California. Why are we not going to hit our clean energy targets? Well, we've made it too hard to build clean energy. So Texas, which does not love clean energy the way California does, is building more clean energy than California is. What happened to high-speed rail? Sort of the same story. And at some point, you begin to realize what you have in a lot of big liberal states, it is true for New York, true for Illinois, true for others, is we have not focused as liberals on creating the supply of the things people need most.
You know, Derek, as you just said, as liberals, and this book is written, both of you consider yourselves sort of liberal, moderate Democrats, but it's largely pushes back at the Democratic Party for being engaged in process, regulation. How much of the problem, let's stick with housing, comes from regulations and rules and everything and NIMBYism and zoning?
Something's happened to the identity of liberalism in this country. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, the New Deal era, we built and built and built, and it was a Democrat, FDR, that got us kickstarted on this habit of building. We built houses and roads. We built transmission lines and electricity. We built dams. We built canals. We built it all. And something happened, I think, to the identity of liberalism in the 1960s and 1970s, where we decided that the key to being a good liberal was being good at the politics of blocking rather than the politics of building. And there were lots of good reasons for this shift. The environmental situation in the 1950s America was horrendous. I mean, people were waking up to waters that were disgusting and air that was choked with smog. And so we made it harder for states and companies to change the physical world. But the medicine of the 20th century that we administered to this country has become the disease of the 21st century. It's simply become too difficult to build in this country. And too often, as we look in the mirror, we see that it is liberals who are responsible for this.
Ezra, why is that liberals did that?
The parties right now, the coalitions, have mirror image problems of each other. The personality type of the right is autocratic, and the personality type of the left is bureaucratic. Liberals are the rule followers, or the people who listen to the lawyers, right? Elon Musk does not listen to the lawyers, to put it gently. In a way, both sides could use a little bit more of what the other one has in excess. Liberals could use a little bit more of a knock it down energy, and certainly the right could use a bit more respect for systems, for institutions, for laws. This is not just a kind of searing act of self-criticism for no reason. Our goals are liberal ones. We've been talking about housing, but decarbonization is a huge part of the book. And one of the reasons it makes sense to aim that conversation at liberals is that they share our goals. We are liberals. We want to decarbonize. When the right builds fossil fuels at a torrid pace, when Donald Trump gets up there, as he has, and tries to destroy the solar and wind industries, which is what he is doing, he just doesn't share our goals. He's not trying to build the world we're trying to build. So there's a second problem, which is simply that our goals are liberal. And so if liberal states are not achieving those goals, like, that's an issue. It was true that for a while, as we were running through the natural space of this country, the question of how to block thoughtless development from happening was a very pressing question. We had functionally no muscle for doing that. Now climate change inverts that. To conserve anything of the climate we've known for the entirety of human civilization, we have to build clean energy infrastructure at a torrid pace. And so now all of a sudden, to preserve the environment, instead of stopping things from happening, you need to make things happen very quickly. That requires new laws, it requires new ideas, it requires a new culture.
So, Derek, on the environmental issue, you in the book talk about the fact that the way the progressives and liberals tend to approach it is stop growth, stop growth. That seems to be antithetical to an abundance agenda. What should they be doing instead?
We need to reinvent what environmentalism means to face the challenges of the 2020s and not the 1960s. And the problems of today are that we cannot continue to grow by burning stuff we find in the ground. We have to use solar and wind and geothermal and, yes, even nuclear power to have a modern economy that people enjoy without destroying the biosphere. That means having a new relationship to building in the physical world, and defining liberalism as what can you build and not what can you block.
So, Ezra, if you look at what President Biden did for clean energy and the infrastructure, there were many things, but one of them was to try to have electric vehicle charging stations across this country. I'll tell a tale about one of my Tulane students who ended up going into city government. He was so proud he was going to help build those charging stations in Louisiana because it's a state thing. And yet, by the end of it, they had built zero because every time he came up with a plan, they said, well, this plan doesn't fit our equity matrix, or it doesn't fit our labor standards, or it doesn't fit this. And so zero got built. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's absolutely what I'm talking about. There's another example like that, which is that in the infrastructure bill, a huge amount of the money in that bill, more than $40 billion, was earmarked for rural broadband. It's a great idea. That was passed in, I forget if it's late 2021 or early 2022. Either way, by the end of 2024, the number of people it had hooked up to broadband was approximately 0 people. You then wonder, why didn't they win? Right? You talk to the Biden people. I've spoken to them many, many times. I know you both have too. And they're very, very, very proud of the decade of infrastructure investment that they set off with the CHIPS Act, with the infrastructure bill, with the IRA. And I think in a way they're confused about why that didn't have more political upside for them. But one reason, maybe not the only, is that people didn't feel it. The money didn't move fast enough. Having, getting $42 billion for broadband isn't all that important if people don't get broadband. And a lot of the book is about this dynamic in which Democrats will pass a big bill. And it is sometimes at the national level, right, like the Inflation Reduction Act, or it's sometimes at the state or local level, like I report in some detail on Los Angeles' efforts to raise money to build affordable housing. And then you look at how it's implemented, and it is the amount of complexity layered onto it is astonishing. And a lot of these intentions are well-meaning. The equity intentions are well-meaning. The environmental things you're building into it are good. But I was talking to somebody who builds affordable housing. And my God, have they been slow in doing that, in using public money in Los Angeles. And she was saying that when she tries to build it, and she's housing people who live in tents under the freeway, she has to go back to the planning board. And they're like, well, you need a higher quality air filtration system because this development will be near a freeway. Higher quality, by the way, than a private development would have. And that's fine, but it is delaying housing when the alternative is people living in no house at all with no filtration system under an overpass underneath the freeway. Liberals should be much angrier about this than conservatives, right? This is a part of modern politics that upsets me. For conservatives, it's fine when government fails. They kind of want it to fail. That proves their point. Liberals should not be excusing it when it fails. They should be fixing it when it fails. They should be making sure it doesn't happen again. And that's what I don't see. That's, I think, the cultural change that needs to happen here.
Let me say that, Derek, there's been such a backlash that we now have, what Trump is doing, what Elon Musk is doing in government. But it's partly a backlash because, as Ezra just said, they were supposed to build broadband internet access and build zero. Whereas Musk and Starlink have put up 1 million since then, likewise put up, hundreds of thousands of chargers. Do you think this is what's causing this backlash that has led to people like Trump and Musk and others wanting to blow up the regulations?
Let's make no mistake. We have in this country a right-wing movement that is trying to destroy government, and not just destroy it to take it over, to purge it of all sources of potential pushback and ideological disagreement, right? Not a coincidence that we're turning over our telecom policy to Elon Musk himself, or that Trump is, getting out into the front lawn of the White House in order to basically make an advertisement for Tesla, or Tesla, as he calls it. We have a government right now which is defining or combining the worst parts of kleptocracy and kakistocracy, government by theft and government of the worst people. All that is to say, we need an opposition movement in this country that is popular and strong and competent. And it's a problem right now that Democrats and the left are unpopular and weak and often not competent in the places that they govern. To elaborate on Ezra's point, it's been a terrible political mistake to measure success in dollars authorized rather than things accomplished. That's how you get California authorizing $33 billion to build a high-speed rail system that doesn't exist. It's how you get a story of a $1.7 million toilet. Yes, $1.7 million public toilet built in San Francisco because the city has such procedural kludge. That's how New York City has the most expensive mile of subway construction in the world. It's how you get the Chicago mayor bragging on Twitter that they spent $11 billion to build 10,000 affordable housing units, coming out to $1.1 million per affordable housing unit. This is the record of a movement that has forgotten to judge political success by outcomes and instead has judged political success by how much money can we spend.
Boy, let me just ask you that, Derek. Why is there no Democratic city mayor who's making the city work?
Well, there are Democratic city mayors making the city work. I mean, there are Democratic city mayors, for example, in the state of North Carolina, in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area, which is adding more residents than almost any metro in the country. That's where I'm living for this year. There are mayors who are making things work. It's happening. And many mayors and many governors are outcome-oriented. Jared Polis from Colorado is a great example of a governor, a Democratic governor, who I think is thinking in a very forward-looking way about the need for housing abundance. How do we bring down regulations? And also, how do we make it easier technologically to put up housing? Because if you can put up housing for cheap, then that reduces the price that people have to pay to live in those units. There are people on our side. There are YIMBYs who are younger progressives. There are people who are...
Explain what a YIMBY is real quick.
Yeah, there are people who are defining themselves, I think, as abundance progressives. There's people on our side, but we're trying to enlarge this movement.
I would add to that, the YIMBYs are the yes in my backyard folks, right? The YIMBYs have their center in San Francisco and California for all the intellectual victories and even bills passed, have not begun building more housing. This is very hard to do. Everybody wants to say, I passed a big bill on affordable housing. Saying I went into the guts of the processes and I closed down a bunch of ways people in the community could come out and voice their objection to somebody building an apartment building down the block, that's a lot less popular. It's a harder fight. You often don't have the power to do it. Maybe the mayor wants to do it, but the board of supervisors doesn't want to do it. You see this all over, right? Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, he knows perfectly well what a problem the housing crisis is, both for California and for any presidential ambitions he might harbor. He has signed bill after bill after bill after bill. But the coalitional dynamics of this aren't easy. And that's why it does require, I think, some long, aggressive ideological change, because nobody wants to focus on process. Right? Nobody wants to hear about it. You don't win elections by saying, well, I've reconstructed the overlapping jurisdictional authorities that created 14 veto points in how we built a public restroom. It makes people in the agencies mad. They get mad at you. They leak things into the press. You have to see it as enough of a crisis to break some eggs. And again, I am, Lord knows, no fan of what DOGE is doing. But I do hope Democrats take one thing from it, which is that there is a lot that they have treated as inviolable in the way government works. A lot of rules, regulations, interagency processes, notes from their lawyers that weren't exactly laws. They were just sort of guidance. And they treated all of it as something that was a hard boundary. You just couldn't do anything about it. I mean, there is a dimension where I think liberals stop. Too many Democrats stop at the first sign of internal bureaucratic resistance. They treat the structure of government as too settled. The Republicans right now are treating it as completely unsettled, and they are trying to unmake it. They are trying to destroy it. I do not want American politics trapped between a party that will not make government work and a party that wants to make government fail. We are going to need, after the sort of institutional defenders that the Democrats became, the institutional arsonists the Republicans became, we're going to need some kind of synthesis, a party, a coalition, a movement that insists on making government work, not because it hates government, not because it doesn't want government to do big things, but precisely because it cares about government and it does want government to do big things.
Derek Thompson, Ezra Klein, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.